right there, Mayor.
Good evening to the September 12th council meeting. I'd like to call the meeting of the Chino City Council and the successor agency to the redevelopment agency to order. Our flag salute this evening will be led by Mayor Pro Tem Comstock.
Thank you, Mayor. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in saluting our nation's flag. Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, I'd like to note that all council members are present with the exception of Councilman Flores, and he is on an excused absence. First item on the agenda is public comment. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the council on any item that is not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, then we will move on. Under presentations, item number 1, City of Chino's self-evaluation and transition plan update. This will be a presentation on the progress of the development of the Americans with Disabilities Act transition plan and community outreach regarding accessibility for people with disabilities in the city of Chino. Our staff report this evening will be provided by Lisa Almilli, Accessibility Coordinator, and Michael Cuniff, Project Manager, Bureau Veritas.
Thank you, Mayor and members of City Council and public. My name is Lisa Almilli. I am the Accessibility Coordinator here for the City of Chino. And with me is Mike Cuniff. I'm going to actually turn it over to him. He's going to give us a presentation on the progress of our self-evaluation and transition plan update.
Thank you, Lisa. Again, my name is Mike Cuniff. I work with Bureau Veritas, and I'm just going to give a quick presentation of where we are to date on the progress, starting out with a little bit of history on the ADA, how we got the why, and then kind of explain the parts of a transition plan, and then give an update on our progress to date. Perfect. So brief agenda. This is sort of what I was just explaining, a little bit of history on the regulations, a little bit of an explanation around the self-evaluation and transition plan. The planning process is sort of a snapshot of where we are, and then looking ahead to where we need to be to finalize the plan. And then question and answers also. The presentation sort of divided into 3 sections. Can certainly allow opportunity in between to answer any questions in the meantime. Let's see. The ADA, and before I really get into it, just wanted to thank Lisa for really championing this effort. She's been a tremendous help to me and the team, so thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that very much. She's also explained that the council is familiar with the ADA. So I will move through these slides a little bit quicker than maybe I normally would. But essentially, it's a Civil Rights Act, and Title II of the ADA is requiring a transition plan for municipalities, state and local governments. So we're 32 years in. Many municipalities don't have one yet, a transition plan that is. We see some of them that are quite old, that were done on a napkin, and filed away, 15 years ago. They're not being acted on. Some things have changed since then. Some new standards, the 2010 standards have been enforceable now for about 11 years. And I guess there's a lot. I can ramble on, Lisa knows. But essentially, we're assessing all the building facilities, parks, public right-of-way. And we're using the current standards. And I'll get to the why behind that essentially. The ADA is divided into 5 titles. We're focused on Title II for this assessment, for this transition plan. This is public entities. Lisa has a presentation after, which is going to deal with Title III. That's essentially businesses that have public accommodations, banks, restaurants, hotels, et cetera. But Title II is the section that regulates state and local governments, so. A little bit of background about how we do the assessment. So part of the transition plan, all of the data and information that informs it, well, most of it is very objective. All of the parks, all of the city buildings, the public right-of-way, it's essentially all been measured. And what we've identified are barriers to accessibility, and that's where what we measured does not comply with current regulations or building code. The slide here about the California Accessibility Code, it's important because we apply CBC, or California Building Code 11B, where it's more restrictive than the ADA. California specifically is more strict in a lot of areas. So if we, and Lisa's familiar with them again, but we have an individual report for each facility, each park. And you'll see references in there where the regulatory standard is California specific. And so it's, I'll skip to the next one. Lisa, you know, feel free to elbow me to keep things moving.
No, it's good. I got to get my elbow up to keep it moving. But as we know, the building code, you know, provides more level of accessibility or is more stringent in the regulations. And so with each survey that Bureau Veritas has done as our consultant for the city, for both buildings and parks, they have you know, noted which regulation being the most stringent within the reports, so.
Yep, thank you. And if they're equivalent, we typically would reference the ADA standard. Some areas that are regulated, essentially it's everything. You know, everything from parking, accessible routes, entrances, restrooms, elements along the accessible route. A lot of times people don't think of stairs as, you know, required to be accessible, but in fact they are. And these handrails actually look pretty good. So what we don't include is areas that aren't really occupied by the public or even most staff. So elevator equipment rooms, rooftops, stuff like that. So you won't see any of those you know, in the reports because there's some pretty broad exceptions for those areas. Thank you.
I'll just keep moving.
Sure. Program access, important thing to note, and a major difference between Title II and Title III of the ADA, regardless of a facility's age. For instance, this building, where if it was a, you know, a business, they would be required to make, you know, some readily achievable barrier removal. But because it's city-owned and it offers programs, those programs are required to be accessible. So regardless of the building age. So what we've done is for the, you know, the physical or the structural assessments, we've I think, and this is on a later slide, but we've documented all of those physical barriers to accessibility. Cool. I'm not going to read this list. It's extensive, but it gives you an idea of, the areas that we're looking at and what is regulated. Now, I apologize too. At the end of every day, I start to lose my voice because I spend a lot of time on the phone. But everything from, the more obvious stuff that people are familiar with, accessible parking, right down to, light switches and protruding objects. So it's it's what we call within our company a comprehensive assessment for each facility and park. Some of the intrinsic benefits. Remediation can be helpful to people who aren't disabled. Strollers is a good example. I have 3 children. They're all older now, but we've gone through the stroller phase, and having a curb ramp can be especially helpful depending on where you're going. Protruding objects are a big one. We often, consider people who are visually impaired, when we look at protruding objects. And what that is something that is between 27 and 80 inches, and it projects from the wall more than 4 inches. So it has people who don't see it run the risk of bumping into it and becoming injured. So, picture your teenager staring at their phone, right? So it can help them from doing the same thing, or even an adult for that matter, walking into a sign and becoming injured. So it does help people in general, not just disabled people.
And one thing I want to add here, just as part of the intrinsic benefits, is that disability is the one minority group that each and every one of us will experience in our lifetime. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so if you are someone with a disability, if you know someone with a disability, maybe it's a little more familiar to you, but if you haven't yet come into experience disability, you will eventually. And so that's, one of the bigger things is we look at building an accessible world and something that has universal access. It's intrinsically beneficial for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's many millions of Americans at this point. So the next several slides are going to give a brief, background of what a transition plan is and some of the major components of that. Thank you. The what? It's a structured plan. I say structured, it's not intended to be rigid. It's intended to be flexible because the needs of a community may change, budgets may change, buildings may be added or built and have to be, included in that transition plan. Things fall out of compliance sometimes. But it's essentially what I like to describe as a roadmap to remediation. We've done a lot of, I guess we could call it heavy lifting with the actual assessments where everything's measured. There's a report for each individual facility. But now we need to do something with all that information, and that's really what the transition plan is a roll-up of all that information in a plan forward. The why, I think the council is probably, more understanding of what that is, more so than others I've presented to. But essentially, it is a requirement of the ADA in a federal law. So that's an important part of it. And the how is, that's where it gets a little more complicated. We need to consider priorities of the plan. We need to consider budgets, and we need to come up with a strategy that is clear, that it's, I'm looking for words. I think, sustainable. That's a great one. And focused, and I think, in the next few slides, we'll see that and sort of how we arrived at what, at the phases we have so far. Having said that, one of the lines in there, you'll see that, when there's a complaint, that plan is intended to be able to address that and not be so rigid that we can't get past it. As far as the planning, I like this one. We've had this one as a slide around for quite a while. I'll spend a couple minutes on this one if that's okay. The two-step evaluation, the facility and program and policy assessments. So I've talked about the facilities a little bit. Each city-owned building and park has its own report. We've identified all, I say all, there's always a chance that we miss one, but we've essentially identified all the barriers to accessibility that are physical in nature. The program and policy review, which Lisa has a draft of, it's not final at the moment, it's under review, but we've also looked at the policies and the programs that the city has and offered some suggestions on where things could be added or changed. And that's something a little bit later on I'll let Lisa expand on a little bit. Initiating the transition planning, that's once we take all of our individual reports and all of our data, coupled with public input, which we've done a couple of events, this being one of them. The other one was Chino Summer Nights, along with a public survey that was hosted online. And developing prioritization, that sort of middle slide is pretty much where we're at now. We've got all the information, and now we're looking at the strategy to prioritize different sites and the amenities within those sites. The budget, we have a lot of that specifically for the city's own buildings and parks. The public right-of-way data is still sort of pending final. And then, the final deliverable or the target is the living transition plan. Did you have something, Lisa? Go ahead.
No, I think what's important, and I'm actually going to go back to the previous slide, developing the prioritization, how we're going to address these things. And then, as Mike mentioned, things, as a living transition plan, things can be flexible in, if we needed to move things around, to move it up because of a complaint or a concern, or if it's something that we're going to be addressing just in some of our capital improvement projects, and then we can move stuff around a little bit. And we'll be doing a lot of that. But right now, just establishing that initial prioritization levels, and Mike's going to go over that shortly. But I think that's all I have.
Yeah, actually, one more point to add to that is all of the individual assessments, they're very objective. We go and we measure, the building or park, and we put together a report and identify the barriers. They're measured, what doesn't fall under a compliant range gets put in there. So there's not usually a whole lot that is contested with those. It's very objective. When we get into the prioritization and the strategy to remove things, we have to identify some priorities and some phasing, and that's where it gets a little more interesting. And we certainly, welcome public input and questions and some direction on that. We do a lot of these, and we have some pretty good, ideas on what should be prioritized, but certainly the opinions of the public, the council, Lisa and her team, we have flexibility in that and how things are organized, so thank you. Yeah, interesting. So the regulations, it says complex but manageable. That's about right. If you read them, it's hundreds of pages long. But the reports and the data that you'll see in the transition plan will help to make that a manageable, piece. The public input, we touched on that a little bit on, what was included, and certainly that's where we've really tried to solicit that input. The goal is the transition plan, with clearly defined priorities and phases. That makes sense. And it's probably going to be impossible to please everybody, but if we have an objective approach that's, part of a good strategy, I think it's a good way to go about it. Good. Planning process. So I guess now's probably a good stopping point. If anyone has questions, comments, certainly happy to address those now. I know this can get a little dry at times talking about all the background, so welcome any comments or questions.
Back on the defined cost parameters, is there anything in the regulation that gives any kind of guideline on basic cost parameters? Like, obviously, you wouldn't do something that would cost $1 million for some small improvement, but are there any actual parameters, guidelines?
There's nothing in the regulations that is really definitive on cost. The regulations state that there has to be a transition plan and essentially gets into the fact that it has to be acted upon, not that it just exists. There's requirements to have accessible programs within the city. And there's a slide in here that will detail that out a little bit, but essentially, if it's an older building and it's really just not feasible to make something accessible, that's when, we need to, not to overuse the saying, but think outside the box a little bit and perhaps relocate the program or make an accommodation for that.
I'm thinking about, we bought the old theater building. And if there were a second story and if it were absolutely impossible to get an elevator in that building, you wouldn't want to tear the building down. Are there ways to make that upper story publicly inaccessible so that you don't have to make it? I mean, if the public does not have access to it, then can it not apply? Can the regulations then be skipped?
So that's a great question. And, when you're looking at employee-only spaces, it doesn't have to be fully accessible unless it needs to be accessible for Title I, which covers employment. So that covers an employment reasonable accommodation. But for buildings, it depends on the use of the building. Again, if you have a two-story building and maybe the upper building is staff only or offices, and the public is open to going on the first floor, any place where the public can go or where programs are offered has to be accessible in a certain way. So I know we're going to be doing some remediation to that building, most likely in the future, but looking at the program part of it, like Mike was saying, we have to make sure the programs are accessible. So that may mean we may have to alter the way we do the business slightly, or the program to make sure that everybody has access to doing it. So we look at that holistically. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to remediate all the structural barriers. So in the reports, like Mike mentioned, they found all the structural barriers to access for the buildings and the parks. And there's still other ways we can provide access without rebuilding a whole building or rebuilding an entire, access point. We might move or shift the program to a more accessible place.
Or could it be, if that building is used for the theater, could it be that just the bottom floor is the public area for programs?
Right, so public spaces is the requirement. So yeah, absolutely. And we'll look at that holistically when we get to that point, for sure.
Okay.
So I have a question about that as well. So I just want to understand, if we're going to open up a second level to the employees, do we have to make it ADA accessible if there isn't a need for that at that particular point? And if we do open it, how quickly do we need to make it ADA accessible to those, to an employee? Or could they sign saying, I don't need a ramp or anything, I can go up the stairs? Or how does that work?
Again, these are all great questions. And so that's, a lot of those issues are covered under Title I of the ADA, which is, housed in our human resources for staff. So if someone needs a reasonable accommodation, then they would go through the process to get a reasonable accommodation for their workspace. For instance, if we have a building or a place that's going to be staff only, and maybe staff work in one building and are moving to another building, they may have a disability that's not a visible disability, but when you move them to this other building, there may be other situational barriers that prohibit them from engaging in their daily work because of barriers. So those things might come up as we move, people to different buildings or have staff come in. I don't know about, basically with the Title I, the staff would have to request the accommodation. And then we have to comply with the laws based on
So
those requests.
specifically what I'm talking about right now is the gray building where the chamber is. We aren't able to use the top story of that because it's not ADA accessible, the way I understand it.
Correct.
And they need more space. I'd like to allow them to do it, but we have to get that all dialed in before we allow that. Is that correct?
Correct. We want to make sure that if it's open to the public, that we have to be able to provide that access. And we do have a report on the gray building. And I know we're doing some projects internally with our capital improvements or buildings and facilities to try and improve some of the things like the restroom, which are part of our report. So we're definitely working towards that. So if there's specifics, we can definitely look at those. There are some exceptions at the historic building code or historic amenities. If they're registered or would be registered with the Federal Register for Historic Properties, there may be some exclusions, but we can look at that to see, what are we offering on the second floor, and is it for the public? Is it for, staff? So,
Well,
we
it
just
wouldn't
have
be
to
for
look
the
at those.
public. It would be for their staff only, if they, when they go up there. When it's accessible, I should say.
Right.
But not open for the public because we don't have that accessibility issue
Right.
up there. But if the staff wanted to go up there and utilize that area, could it happen without having to go through all the construction and the issues that we're discussing right now?
I think as far as Title II of the ADA, that would probably be okay. We're looking at an existing building that likely predates the regulations. And so unless there's an alteration, there's no trigger to make expensive modifications to that until you introduce a program or service of the government. So if you had, I don't know, a yoga class that was going to take place upstairs and it was the only one available, it would either need to be made accessible, physically or, relocated to a place that is.
But again, if it is not a program for the public, if it's for an agency's employees, say they do have one person that has a disability that makes it impossible for them to climb stairs, and there's no feasible alternative to get upstairs, then their workspace downstairs could be modified to accommodate them, correct?
That would fall under Title I of the ADA, which is employment. Lisa's probably better equipped to answer that, but I think that, to me, that sounds like a reasonable accommodation unless we're, isolating that employee somehow.
It just seems like there's got to be some kind of common sense. I mean, if you have an old building that cannot accommodate an elevator, it just seems impractical to go to a real extreme to try to figure out how to do an elevator for one person if you can accommodate them in another location.
Right, and I think, with the working space, as long as the employee can do their job with reasonable accommodations. So if their space is located on the first floor and other people are located on the second floor, but there's no meeting rooms on the second floor, like they can't have meeting rooms upstairs because then that person would be excluded, or, have meetings or some sort of anything like that. If it's just literal working spaces, then that might be something we could look at. I mean, we have to look at it and see what the intent is and to make sure that they're not excluding someone.
Okay.
It is our building, so, we are responsible for making that also. It's just kind of, it turns to a really weird gray line with the leasing
So
of buildings.
the key word to me seems to be reasonable accommodation.
Correct.
I
Correct.
believe there is, if I may chime in, provisions in Title II, and I just looked it up, that explain that compliance with the requirements of the section is not required when an entity can demonstrate that it is structurally impracticable to meet the requirements. And it goes on by saying full compliance will be considered structurally impracticable only when there are rare instances when the unique characteristics of the terrain prevent the incorporation of accessibility features. So in your scenario, for that particular building, it's structurally or physically impractical to add an elevator. I think the city would be able to make a showing to support that conclusion.
Okay.
And I think that, I would suspect that would be part of the plan to demonstrate that, yes, the bottom floor may be made accessible. That's where the public receives the public services, but the rest would be impractical for these reasons.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions or comments?
As you, Mayor. Mayor, I think my experience in working with the city is we've had those exact situations you've spoken about because of some of our facilities are older.
Right.
And I've always been able to work with HR or some of our accessibility coordinators in the past to accommodate employees. And that doesn't just happen in some of our older buildings. It can also happen in a newer police facility where we have employees come across an injury or some sort of situation. We've had to accommodate them in the past. And when it comes to that component, I think that our staff does a good job. I think it gets trickier when you start involving members of the public or to different locations or programming or hosting public meetings, which I think is perhaps the intent of some of these sections.
100%.
I have a statement as well as a question. So when we look at this plan, is it, I guess the way when I think of it in my head, I look at it as like almost the living general plan for us as it applies to accessibility. Is that the general thought behind drafting this and following it? It's intended to provide us guidance on this or direction? And in that direction, do these plans also include prudent policy?
The short answer is yes. So the living part of the plan is that what we don't want is to get or deliver, a 2,500
An unattainable,
page
right.
PDF, and it gets, filed away somewhere and never acted upon. So the living is intended to be the fact that it is reviewed, periodically, once a year, and updated, and acted upon. So that's the living part of it. The strategy or the roadmap part of it is, I guess to summarize it, there's a lot of data. There's an immense amount of data, especially when we start looking at the public right-of-way stuff. So we want to be able to show and deliver a transition plan that is, understandable, and it breaks up all this information and provides a roadmap that's clear, and manageable, I guess is.
Okay. My next question is, approximately how many facilities will this report contain? Now that you've compiled, went out and assessed all of them, about how many facilities approximately?
I think there were 67 or 69 facilities included.
Okay, so some are right around 70?
Yep. And just to kind of clarify one part of that, at the beginning stages, we worked with Lisa, and we are including, as part of that, 67, approximately 22 to 25 sites that were assessed by Calabrese Architects, within the last probably 5 years. Okay. So what we've done with that information is import it into our software.
Okay.
And that's going to come at a later stage when we do the final. We have a software system that's going to allow, Lisa or whoever, department heads, whoever gets access to it, to sort of look at it and manage the data in a way that's, I think, a lot more user-friendly than a static, either printed or PDF report.
Okay. My last question is, does this report also, the facilities sound like they're separate from the public right-of-way analysis? Because of how much more complicated and vast the public right-of-way
Yeah,
piece is?
it's a great question. The answer is yes. We have individual reports for each facility in each park. And then we'll have one standalone report for the public right-of-way inventory, which would include sidewalks, curb ramps, pedestrian signals, transit stops. It's harder to pin that one down because it's citywide. So we find that it works best as it's a standalone report that gets embedded in a way into the transition plan.
Thank you.
One last question, going off of what Karen asked. As you accomplish these upgrades, are you going to be updating this report?
Yes, so the software that Bureau Veritas is talking about, the asset calc software for the facilities and for the parks, any remediations that we do, there's a way to be able to put in the remediation, a new picture, check it off, check the box, which is fantastic, and then also run a report. So annually, we're thinking about annually doing an update to kind of just see like how many, where are we at, what did we check off, what do we have left, what did we shift around, prioritize, as the living document piece. With the public right-of-way, the data will be embedded into our GIS system, and so we will also create internal workflows to be able to, again, have the picture, the measurements, all that uploaded so that we can start checking off those facilities. So that's the idea of the living document, is to be able to take what was found and then provide those remediations and put it into our plan. So it'll just constantly be updated.
So at any point in time, if we're challenged, we can readily tell them what's been done.
Right, and we'll probably look at doing, like I said, an annual report of that, as well as being able to say when something's going to be remediated based on the prioritization or the schedule. And again, that can be a little bit more flexible, but yes, absolutely.
Great. Mark?
Yeah, as you know, we're gonna be doing some work in our older part of town, which is basically across the street. And some of those we've established that we have created some curbing that now we have some standards that have worked in other areas, and we're gonna try to do that in some of these areas. Some may work, some may not work. Have you looked at those basic standards, the ones that we have already done that we potentially are gonna do in the older part? And have you looked to see that they do actually meet the regulations of ADA and everything that we've been challenged with, where we can utilize these things and be able to move forward quickly so that we're not held up like we have been in the past?
For clarification, are you referring to like our curb ramp standards and those?
Correct.
So in our city standards, so yes, go ahead and you can.
Yeah, I can, thank you, Lisa. I can expand on that a little bit. What we're using for the public right-of-way assessment are a couple things. PROAG, which is the public right-of-way accessibility guidelines. We do typically, for California projects, pull in Caltrans. In this case, the city of Chino has standards that even exceed the Caltrans stuff on many levels. So very similar to how we conduct our building and park surveys, we're using the more restrictive standard in force, if that makes sense, which in many instances, it's the city of Chino standards that we're using.
Any other comments, questions? Okay.
So this slide is a sort of a snapshot of where we are in the process. The transition plan is not yet final. We have a preliminary draft in with Lisa, but to inform that, we've done, I guess it is 67 facilities and parks. We've identified just under 2,000 individual barriers to accessibility. I know that it does sound like a lot. I can share that we've seen that many in one facility before, just a larger facility. I think it was a stadium or something like that. But what the plan will do is break that down into manageable pieces. The cost, we're still working with that. Those get a little bit muddied because if we're looking at those barriers at an individual level, the scope of work may increase beyond it. For instance, if you're looking at an accessible parking space, the cost associated with that will be just the space. In many cases, there's a mill and overlay of the entire parking lot or a larger portion of that. So we like to call those costs sort of some rough order of magnitude. But those assessments at this point are all complete. The drafts are done. There's still a handful that we're working through some edits before we call them final. But really marked progress on that level. As well as the next part, the public right-of-way assessment. There's a lot of information and a lot of mileage to cover here. So we've assessed, this slide says 427 out of 467 miles of sidewalk. I think we're actually at the 100% mark now. Our company did an assessment a few years ago with San Bernardino County. So some of the difference on the mileage is information we already had from just a couple of years ago. 3,600 plus curb ramps were assessed. Those are going to have measurements such as running slope, cross slope, flares, landings, all sorts of information on those, as well as transit stops and signalized intersections. The program and policy assessment, I think we touched on that earlier. we have a draft version of that in with Lisa now, so we're reviewing that together and seeing where, certain city policies could be tweaked or added. And I think, did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So basically, the programs and policies review entailed a website review. It also entailed effective communication, as well as emergency planning and procedures. But it also entailed our hiring processes, our events and programs, our advertising, social media, how we're getting words out to the public. And so some of the recommendations is more of an action plan of this piece, which is to develop policies, maybe like an effective communication policy and having all the things there. We have the procedures in place, but I think that there were some things that, just kind of holistically bringing it together, which so will be itemized in this transition plan as well, related to those things. So I was pretty pleased with the outcome. So I'm still reviewing that, and we're making some finals on those.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And one other component of that review was a website analysis. So that gets put into the program and policy review as an appendix, and that was shared, I want to say back in late June. And I think there's already, some of that is already in the works. And then the last bullet item on this list here is the public survey. This was an online survey that Lisa really championed this, but we tried to promote it on several levels. Social media, the city website, live events and some flyers. I think even some direct mailings. We get some good responses, not a lot, but some good, well thought out responses. So those will help inform the plan. A slide here, I'm not going to read all of the locations, but I think the executive summary here is we've initially broken it up into 5 different phases. The first phases are going to focus on, what are the sites with the highest public use, and then, the later phases are going to have, the least public use. And, this is an important one. I don't want to skip through it, because I think this is where we really want to solicit the input from, not just the public, but, from city council, from department heads, from Lisa. The individual reports I mentioned earlier are very objective. We go out and measure everything. Here's where we want to make sure we have a good strategy on how to prioritize these. Within each site, so if we're looking at, the phase 1 site list, within each of those sites, there's also ways to, put some initial focus on amenity types. So where accessible parking may have a greater impact. These are actually pulled from the 91 standards, the federal standards. And the thought process is that, people should be able to arrive at a site and be able to enter the building, before we're worried about, drinking fountains and vending machines and stuff like that. And that's really where these come from. They were, in fact, removed from the 2010 standards. And the reason for that is very closely tied to your question earlier, where it may not be practical, it may not even be feasible at all to put in an elevator, which would be a priority 1 barrier. But that doesn't, the intent here is that shouldn't hamstring the other barrier removals that may be a lower priority. So this is guidance, but it's not intended to be rigid. Also on this slide, we have employee spaces as priority 5. And I mentioned to Lisa earlier, I wanted to explain this because it is not to diminish the importance of the employee at all whatsoever. The reason for having it as 5 is because it is covered under Title I. And if an employee makes an accommodation request, it would be right to the top of the list. The other part of that is the employees are a known group of people, where the public isn't. Somebody with a disability could try to access a program at any point. So that's the sort of the logic behind that, where we place the emphasis on public access. Yeah, public right away. It's a big animal. There's a lot of information here. I can give a snapshot of where we are. The equipment we use to measure the sidewalk, some of you may have seen it. It's essentially, it looks like a stroller. There's a lot of sophisticated onboard electronics, but we're able to gather detailed information on the sidewalks, like cross slope, running slope, vertical changes, condition of the surface, essentially at a walking speed, slow walk. But and so with all that information, we're going to be able to identify, some areas that should take priority over others. Similarly, the curb ramps, we use a tool that is similar looking to a metal detector, but it sort of takes the place of a digital level and a tape measure. So we're able to provide all the slope and measurement information on the curb ramps. The cost here, it says it's pending. We've got all the information collected. We go through a pretty thorough post-processing effort, so some of that information is going to be available in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, next slide. So not unlike what we do with the parks and facilities, we also have a prioritization strategy for the public right-of-way. And essentially, there's a couple of charts here that are going to explain that. But if we look at the top chart, and that's relevant to sidewalks, there's a bunch of metrics that we use, and there's some of them here. It's not all inclusive, but vertical level changes can be very difficult for wheelchair users or even people who are ambulatory, that they could pose a tripping hazard. So we look at the worst offenders and assign that a priority 1. Not to get it too into the weeds, but what we do, instead of looking at each metric individually, is we generate a score for the sidewalk. So we'll look at vertical changes, cross slope, surface condition, width. And we find that it works well to kind of give it a report card grade. And we can look at that at a block level. We call them runs, or a 10-foot segment. Similar for curb ramps, we do the same thing. We take all the metrics and we roll it up and give it a grade, and that way we're able to address the sort of the worst offenders. So a missing curb ramp, or one that's damaged beyond usability, would get a score of 0, 0 to 1, and then something that's compliant would be a 5. We're compliant or very near compliant. The other part of that prioritization is that we want to look at the worst offenders, but then we want to focus on the areas that are going to have the most impact. And so the first bullet point is, locations of citizen complaint, right? If there's an active, request or complaint that something is unusable for someone, that should take priority, where possible, for sure. And then we're looking at areas that are serving government properties and programs, outside City Hall, for instance. Transportation is next on the list, so we're, transit stops, stuff like that. And then retail, commercial districts. And so when the report's developed, you'll see this kind of roadmap in a little bit more detail, but this is sort of the overall strategy we're looking at. And, finally, residential areas, which, in general, see the least amount of pedestrian traffic. Public survey. So we held an online survey, and now I should have wrote down the dates when it was open. It was open for a month. I think it closed on the 19th of August.
It closed on the 20th of August. We had it open for a couple of months.
It was, yeah. Thank you. Good memory. And so what this is it's sort of a roll-up of the responses of the buildings that people frequented most. And you can see, the Carolyn Owens Center, some of the community centers, City Hall made the list here. And what you'll find is that this corresponds to very closely with the Phase 1, facilities that we have identified in the plan to date. And then the next slide is the same thing for the parks. So Ayala Park clearly, had the most people, answering that's the location they visit the most. And that's also in Phase 1, as is Heritage, and I think Monte Vista was as well. So we're looking at the public survey results and then, coupled with, the programs that are offered to develop that. So I'm not sure how we're doing on time here, but essentially, with all this information, we're looking to create a detailed living transition plan and be able to track that as we, move through the years. Cool. Yeah, and then there's, some informational slides here at the end. Some really good ADA resources, actually. I know, Lisa's familiar with these for sure, but we like to provide this at the end.
Okay, questions or comments from council members? Mark, do you have anything? Karen? Curtis? Good job. It'll be interesting to see this report. And I, in particular, am interested to see how we're going to apply the earmarked funding from the lawsuit in the preserve area on the needs that are assessed down there. Because I'd like that closely tracked as well. Show that we're using that money appropriately.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Good
Great.
presentation.
Good job, you guys.
Are there
Thank
any
you, I appreciate
questions
it.
from the audience or comments? Okay, seeing none. See, this doesn't take any action, so we'll move on to item number 2, assisting small businesses, the benefit of certified access specialists. This is going to be a presentation on the state of California's Certified Access Specialist Program and the benefits available for businesses who obtain a CASB report to remove barriers to accessibility. Staff report, once again, will be from Lisa and Mike Haru.
Thank you again, Mayor and members of City Council. Again, my name is Lisa Almilli. I'm the Accessibility Coordinator for the city. And so now I'm going to be providing an informational overview on businesses and accessibility. I felt it tied into tonight's topics. And while this relates to all businesses, I'm going to focus more on the small business side because I think there are some benefits that are more valuable to them that I want to emphasize today. So previously, we talked a lot heavily more about like the regulations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And as mentioned, Title II is focused on state and local governments. Title III is what I'll be focusing on during this brief presentation, which covers businesses and places of public accommodation. So as we know, under the ADA, discrimination on the basis of disability is prohibited. The ADA requires that newly constructed and altered facilities be fully accessible. The city's building division ensures compliance with state and federal regulations through the plan review process and building inspection for all new construction and alteration projects. One other specific requirement for businesses is what's called readily achievable barrier removal. And this is where physical barriers to access in existing facilities can be removed without much difficulty or expense. This is very specific to Title III entities. Some examples of that, it's an ongoing obligation, and even when there's no alteration that triggers these remediations, the readily achievable barrier removal is something that needs to continue to have focus by business owners and occupants of public accommodation. Some examples might be raising or lowering counters or adjusting the speed or weight of force used to open the door. Also relocating furniture just to make sure there's an accessible route through the business. And so this is the area that unfortunately, but oftentimes, customers are likely to file complaints for lawsuits for noncompliance. So on the screen is some of the laws in California that are designed to protect business owners in these situations. In 2003, the Division of the State Architect established a program for Voluntary Certified Access Specialists, or CASP. And I'll talk more about what that is in a moment. In 2008, CRASCA was created to provide the regulations for CASPs, as well as to establish the benefits for qualified defendants. And in 2012, a reduction in the statutory damages was introduced for those defendants who had hired a CASP. The Disability Access Compliance Fund through DSA was also established, and that is to strengthen the state's CASP program. With this fund, businesses pay a $4 fee upon issuance or renewal of a business license every year. The fees go toward maintaining the CASP program, developing best practices, and providing educational and training resources at both the state and local levels to promote accessibility compliance. So what is a CASP? A CASP is an individual who is experienced, trained, and tested to inspect buildings and sites for compliance with state and federal accessibility standards. In order to be eligible to take the certification test, a person must meet certain criteria and have knowledge and expertise in very specific fields. The certification test is 2 parts, and it requires extensive knowledge of not only the state building codes, but also the federal regulations and guidelines, as you see on the screen. The test is offered 3 times a year, and the passing rate is only 30%. So that means for the 20 years that the program has been in existence, there are only about 1,000 certified access specialists in the state. So if a business hires a CASP to inspect their business, they receive what's called a CASP report, and they become instantly a qualified defendant if a lawsuit for accessibility is filed. Some of the benefits of having the CASP report are a 90-day stay on any court proceedings, as well as an early evaluation conference, which is a court-run conference to potentially settle the lawsuit. The reduction in damages from $4,000 to $1,000 is a huge benefit, especially for small business owners. And with a CASP report, businesses can also get some reimbursement through CalCap on loans for access improvements, as well as tax credits from the IRS when they're doing these improvements for compliance. However, without a CASP inspection and report, a business does not get access to any of these benefits if a lawsuit is filed for accessibility barriers. Two of the most common questions that are asked are, how much does a CASP inspection cost? And how do I hire a CASP? So for small to medium businesses, it can cost anywhere from $800 to $2,000, depending on the building's amenities. The more amenities, the greater the cost. DSA has a listing of all the certified CASPs in the state who are available for inspection, because not all are available to do external private inspections. They may work for cities or different things that require them to focus more on their job duties than provide this extra service.
Excuse me, Lisa, what's DSA?
I'm sorry, it's the Division of the State Architect.
Oh,
So the state of California, they have a listing there on their website. And so you can go and select a CASP and hire a CASP. Businesses can hire a CASP directly, or they can go through an agency that may provide that type of service where they hire out CASPs.
Okay.
As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Accessibility Compliance Fund was established in 2012 with Senate Bill 1186. The city retains 90% of the $4 business licensing fees that go into a separate accessibility compliance fund. This separate fund can only be used for the training and retention of CASPs within the city to meet the needs of the public specifically. The monies are used for training and tools for building inspectors and staff who work in divisions involved with construction-related accessibility. Recently, this council approved certification pay for CASPs, which comes directly from this fund and is one way to motivate existing team members to become certified. We currently, at the city, have 2 CASPs in our building division. One is our supervising plans examiner and also our recently promoted building official. They both have played key roles not only in ensuring Chino businesses are constructed under federal and state requirements, but also have provided their expertise on city-driven construction projects. With the certification pay incentive, what we really want to do is encourage our existing building staff to become CASP certified so that we can further assist small businesses with compliance. Another reason is that there's a requirement. Of course, everything comes down to the law, right? There's a requirement under Civil Code 55.53 that a jurisdiction must employ a sufficient number of CASPs, 50% of which must be in the building inspection department. So moving forward, we are planning to coordinate with the chamber and some other organizations to do presentations for business owners so that they are aware about the benefits of having these CASP reports and that they can safeguard against potential lawsuits, especially related to accessibility. Once we have more CASPs on staff, we can examine how we can further support the small business community here in Chino. Today was more just an overview of the ADA requirements and some of those benefits that are available to small businesses. And we're hopeful that the CASP program here in Chino will continue to thrive so we can move forward in assisting our businesses to provide access for all of their potential customers here in Chino. And that concludes my presentation, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions or comments? No? I know some of our businesses several years ago were, I'll say, victimized by, I guess, certain individuals who targeted businesses for lawsuits, which was really a shame. I mean, Lisa, some of them were ridiculous, like something would be off 1/4 of an inch and they would sue for correction. This CASP program, will that help those businesses avoid those extensive costs when the item that's not in compliance is so minutely out of compliance?
So that's a great question, and that one of the benefits of having the CASP inspection and report is that business owners then become what's called a qualified defendant. And so that's why the state established this program, so that those damages automatically drop from 4,000 to 1,000. They get a stay, an immediate 90-day stay. They get an early evaluation conference, and all those benefits that come with that. Sometimes, and I'm familiar with what you're referring to, because we do have what's called a lot of these drive-by lawsuits, where people will drive by and see that there's no accessible parking space, and then boom, they've got this lawsuit. And so the CASP inspection can help business owners to be prepared for that. It would provide them with a list of all the barriers in their business, including that quarter-inch difference. And maybe it's something as easy as moving the shelving over so that the aisle does have that full width, or what have you. It may be one of those readily achievable barriers that can be removed at some low or no cost. So the report will identify those, much as the reports for our Title II ADA transition plan identify those. But this is very specific to, that report then goes to the business, it gets filed with the state, and so then the business owner can then start working on remediating some of those and access some of that extra funding that might be available to them. So yes, I do believe that it can help business owners to identify what's in compliance and what's not.
Is there any hope for common sense when it comes to something that is so fine off, like let's say the sink is 1/4 of an inch too close to the toilet, so you would literally have to tear something completely out and reinstall it for 1/4 of an inch? Is there any kind of common sense help for those kinds of issues to do, like pre-existing, it's impractical to move it?
So that's a kind of a loaded question, right? And so it depends on what kind of attorney you hire and what kind of attorney they have, kind of a thing. So, but the reality is, the goal is to make things usable for everybody.
Right.
And so, as Lisa indicated earlier, some of these lawsuits are just drive-bys, and some of these lawsuits are just for people to try and get a quick dollar. We have even found out some of these people who have filed these lawsuits don't even have a disability, or the disability that they're targeting or the area that they're targeting doesn't even pertain to what their disability is about.
Right.
So I think these small things are not these types of people's targets. They're looking for obvious situations, for gross violations, if you will. So if that sink is 1/4 inch off, that's not going to be the target of these types of lawsuits. It's going to be the inaccessible entrance, steps to the front door, the parking stall that's not in compliance, things like that. So, but going back to Lisa's point, if you can pull the slide back that shows CASP certification. So you might have seen these on some businesses and things like that. I've seen them around town. That's the same one. This is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for businesses, but it does give them a kind of a roadmap for success to show them the area that they are deficient in. But it also, what I'm hearing and what I'm finding out, it kind of deters these drive-by lawsuits, because as Lisa indicated, it really reduces the dollar amount. So just like any somebody maybe with not the best intentions, and I'll leave it at that, are going to see this, they're not going to get top dollar from this business. And they're going to know that this business is now trying to achieve compliance, and so they're going to go on to the next,
Okay.
and things like that.
Now, you're going to be contacting when you say small businesses, you're going to be using the chamber. What about businesses that don't belong to the chamber? Because we have all the business licenses, right?
Absolutely.
How do you categorize small business?
Right. Well, I mean, staff's going to be working together to provide presentations and go out with different organizations in addition to the chamber. I'll work with our assistant city manager and our redevelopment department to make sure that we're getting the word out, just to kind of let people know what's available. Again, it's a voluntary inspection. People don't like that word, inspection, but it is a voluntary inspection that has a lot of benefits. And going back also to the previous mention, is that when we do our plans examining, our plans examiner, who is a CASP, will catch those deficiencies of it's a 1/4 inch too far away from the wall if we're remodeling a bathroom or building from, ground up. So we do provide that to businesses when they're doing those additions and alterations. But yes, we will be working to get out to the business community. We'll be working probably also through our website. I'll be working closely with our team here at the city to, just kind of get the word out that this is available to people.
Terrific. Mark?
Just, so I know that each business license pays $4 into this CASP system. So the new businesses that are coming into the city that we're doing inspections on, before they open up, so this is going to be a service we're going to provide for them? We're going to have somebody out there that's CASP certified that can look at their business and kind of give them an idea of what they need to do to become compliant. And I'm just asking for the new businesses coming in. Obviously, the businesses that are already established, obviously, we're going to have to go back and do. But from this point forward, any business that opens is going to have that ability to have that.
Correct. And so, but moving forward, though, these buildings, these new constructions, these new amenities, and these new features are all going to be plan reviewed by CASP, city CASP, and then inspected by a city CASP. So at the end of the day, they're already certified.
Okay.
They've already gone through the process, if you will.
And will they automatically get this sticker?
This is for an existing situation, these existing buildings.
They won't be on, this kind of sticker won't be on a
Won't be
new
on their
building?
door, no.
Oh, okay. Anything else? Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you very much. This has been very informative, and I guess, hopefully the businesses will access the services that we're going to provide and help them offset some of these ridiculous lawsuits.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any comments or questions from the audience on our last item? Okay, seeing none, then if there's no other business to come to us, anything, Linda? Nothing? Okay, then we will adjourn to our next regular meeting that will be held on Tuesday, September 19th at 6, with closed session starting no earlier than 4 o'clock if needed. With that, we are adjourned.